is my pleasure to welcome you to this event celebrating the publication of No Solo Velázquez by our esteemed colleague, Professor Jonathan Brown. My name is Jordana Mendelson. I'm the director of the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center at NYU, which is a co-sponsor of the event along with the Institute of Fine Arts. The event has been organized by Robert Lubar and Estrella Diego and will feature presentations by them, as well as Edward Sullivan, Reva Wolf, Miguel Falomir, and Francisco Chaparro. I will introduce each of our panelists before they speak. I want to also thank Raul Garcia Bravo from Cátedra Madrid, which is the publisher of Jonathan's book, for his enthusiastic support of this event. Over the next hour, our panelists will share their thoughts about this remarkable publication and their connection with Jonathan and his work on Velázquez over the years. The conversation will be recorded and posted later to the IFA and KJCC websites. The KJCC is also hosting through Wednesday at noon a live stream of Andres Sanz's 2019 movie El Cuadro, in which Jonathan is featured prominently along with other esteemed historians, curators, conservators, and critics in discussion about Velázquez's Las Meninas. Please see the KJCC website under events for more information. Before we begin, I would like to add my congratulations to Professor Brown. While I have never had the honor of being his students nor attending his seminars at the IFA, he has been to me a mentor, role model, and has always extended his knowledge and friendship to me in unconditional ways. Going back decades, in fact, from when he directed the seminar in Soria that I participated in as a graduate student on the invitation of Rob and Estrella, to our bus ride together, which I'm sure you won't remember, decades ago, where we were both on our way from Barajas to Madrid. He was headed, no doubt, to meetings at the Prado Museum, and I think I was headed to research at the Biblioteca Nacional. When I came to NYU 13 years ago and realized that I was now part of a faculty that includes Jonathan, Rob, Edward, and my good friend Miriam Basilio, I could not have been happier. For Jonathan, along with my other NYU colleagues, have always modeled for me the highest levels of academic achievement, along with the even more important values of friendship, collegiality, and respect, something that we'll see on full display this afternoon. Jonathan, you are the model to which we all aspire, and I am thrilled to celebrate your newest publication today with hundreds of other friends, colleagues, and students who are joining us remotely on this occasion. Our first speaker is Estrella Diego, who is a professor of modern and contemporary art at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, and a member of the Real Academia de Bellas Artes San Fernando. Estrella, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jordana, for your kind introduction. And of course, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be very brief today. I'm going to be extremely brief because there's lots of our colleagues that have more interesting things to say about Jonathan's book. But I would like to thank, of course, the Institute of Fine Arts and the King Juan Carlos I Center for the generosity and hospitality in hosting the event. And my very, very special thanks to Rob Lubar, to Professor Lubar, for organizing this event. And of course, for so many years of friendship and partnership. I think the nice thing about this event today is that students, Jonathan's students, friends, etc., are gathering together to celebrate his recent book in Spanish, No Solo Velázquez. You know, from my point of view, having a published book in my hands is always a remarkable event. I think it's a remarkable event for all of us because, as you can see from our houses, we all love books. I mean, there's lots of books shelves in all our houses, and in this case, from my point of view, it's really a dream come true. In fact, about 3 years ago, I started thinking it would be great and very exciting to translate into Spanish some of Jonathan's articles to show how wide his interests in our history have been and are. Of course, as you all know, Jonathan Brown has written immensely about a vast number of topics. But of course, the idea that he's one of the main experts, I would say, on Velázquez, in some cases, have sometimes overshadows other topics he has written and discussed brilliantly over the years, from collecting to Goya, Picasso, etc. That was the reason of the title of the book. It came to our minds almost like a pun. Brown had written about so many topics related to art history. He had not written only about Velázquez, no solo Velázquez, of course. And of course, I mean, I thought it would be great to have this text gathered in a volume, translated into Spanish. Mind you, that wouldn't be an easy task, because we sometimes forget that Jonathan is an amazing writer. I mean, his use of English is really so precise. His use of language is so elegant that translating Jonathan into Spanish and having like a volume of Jonathan translated into Spanish wouldn't be an easy task. But anyway, I thought it was, the effort was worthwhile, and it would be great to have access to all these texts in Spanish as a whole, like a whole book. And of course, I shared the idea with Raúl García first, trying to explore whether Editorial Cátedra would be interested in this book. And he was fascinated, and he was absolutely enthusiastic from the very beginning. So my thanks today go again to Raúl García, because he worked very hard with the book, illustrations, etc., etc. As we all know these days, having an illustrated art history book is not an easy task. Again, not only translated Jonathan Brown. And of course, Raúl was very enthusiastic, as I said, and I want to thank him for his support and generosity and patience throughout these years that we have been working together in the book. I can tell you, the publishing house Cátedra was thrilled, delighted to publish the book. And as I said, I want to thank them both a lot. Of course, immediately I thought I should speak to Rob Lubar for, this amazing adventure should be, shared with one of my great friends and colleagues, Rob. I thought it would be great to share the work and to work together in this project. And next we spoke to Jonathan, of course, and he seemed to be happy too. And so our beautiful adventure started, progressing little by little. And today it's a special day because finally the book is in our hands. When you have been dreaming about a book and then the book is there, it's really thrilling. And of course, Francisco had been very special and very important in all this adventure. First of all, because he's been working in a very accurate and amazing way to translate the articles, and he's been curating the illustrations of the book, among other things. So let me thank Francisco for his great job. Francisco when I met him, he had just finished, had read his Ph.D. Of course, the director was Jonathan. And of course, let me thank the rest of Jonathan friends and colleagues for their help and advice. We've been very often calling them, writing them, trying to have like a collective, work, like a collective book, of course, written by Jonathan, but sort of shared with lots of friends who admire and love Jonathan Brown. And of course, and I promise I'll be very brief, and I'm about to finish, my special thanks should go to Jonathan Brown, of course, once and again for his passion in art history and for his very valuable work in this book. Thank you, Jonathan, for being so involved with the publication. And most of all, thank you so much for so many years of friendship and mentoring. Jordana was expressing it very well a few minutes ago. To all of us, and for writing so many amazing texts that, of course, have not only been about Velázquez. Thank you, Jordana. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Estrella. Next, I'd like to invite Robert Lubar, who is an associate professor of modern art at the Institute of Fine Arts, and he's going to continue to present the book. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Jordi. When my dear friend Estrella approached me 3 years ago with an invitation to collaborate on a selected edition of Jonathan's writings, all to be published in Spanish, I of course gladly accepted, but with the understanding that Jonathan would in fact curate his own volume. How could it be otherwise? Thus it began, with Jonathan sending us a list of publications he had carefully selected. This is, after all, Jonathan's book. Our task was primarily to give the volume, Jonathan's volume, shape, structure, and a name. Not only Velázquez, no solo Velázquez, was Estrella's ingenious title, although the range and richness of Jonathan's writings come as no surprise to those of us who have been reading his work for decades. It is, after all, as a scholar Velázquez for which Jonathan is recognized as one of the world's preeminent authorities. So, bucking popular tradition, we thought a selected edition of his essays with a title that would both acknowledge Jonathan's prodigious and groundbreaking work on Velázquez and chart some of those other intellectual territories seemed appropriate. The book that resulted should not be viewed as an homage to Jonathan. Our beloved colleague has already been the subject of a magnificent festschrift, and he has been the recipient of more honors and accolades than I can possibly cite in the few minutes allotted to me today. No, this book, like Jonathan's writing style, was conceived as an accessible volume of lucid and deeply readable essays that we trust will appeal to both the specialist and to a broader educated public. No Solo Velázquez is divided into 3 sections, 2 with 6 essays each, and the final with 7. The final essay, like Jonathan's thinking, takes us full circle as Jonathan considers Picasso in relation to the Spanish pictorial tradition. That circle spans more than 4 centuries, from Flanders and Italy in the early 16th century to the court of Philip II, and from artistic relations between Spain and Great Britain in the early 17th century to Picasso on the cusp of the 20th. And as his final 2 essays suggest, there is every reason to believe that what we call Spanish art, or perhaps more precisely, art in Spain, is, to quote Jonathan, una tradición duradera, as the past continues to speak to the present moment and will undoubtedly continue to do so for future generations. The 3 sections of the book to which I have alluded are patronage and collecting, cultures and contexts, and new views, old masters. In considering the first section, we should observe that Jonathan helped usher in the study of patronage and collecting as central foci of art historical investigation, prying these subjects away from the tastes of polite society and reinscribing them as social phenomena worthy of scholarly inquiry. From the collections of figures like the Duque de Alcalá to monastic patronage, royal collections, and the position and obligations of Velázquez himself as a pintor de corte, Jonathan has relocated patronage and context within a wider field of economic, political, and social relations. The second section, Cultures and Contexts, examines the complex artistic and political relations Spanish artists maintained internationally, the crossing and cross-fertilization of cultures between the new and old worlds through expansive artistic and social networks, Spanish academies of art in the 17th century, and attempts by artists to further their social status, and the politics of representation in the images of the king's minister, from Rubens and the Duke of Buckingham to Velázquez and the Count of Olivares in the age of Richelieu in France. Finally, New View's Old Masters provides close readings of lesser-known bodies of work by Ribera, of Murillo as a painter of erotic themes, of the connoisseurship of Velázquez's portrait of a man in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, its restoration and its attribution as a work by the artist, and the possible identity of the sitter as one of the characters in The Surrender at Breda. Another text turns to questions of attribution surrounding Goya's Lechera de Bordeaux, which Jonathan scrupulously examines using textual, technical, and biographical evidence. The section ends with a consideration of the Spanish artistic tradition itself as both a succession of works of art through time and as a visual archive from which artists draw a range of forms, motifs, and ideas at specific historical junctures and for specific reasons that locate them simultaneously as the heirs to and links within a tradition. To cover this ground in as cursory a manner as I have done does not, of course, do justice to Jonathan's clarity of thought and his pristine writing, but it does have the advantage of underscoring the range of resources and approaches that Jonathan draws upon in these essays. Jonathan's work is deeply embedded in the rich textures of history, art's location in a constellation of political, economic, social, cultural, and institutional forces, and in the materiality of works of art. His thinking is always based on a vast storehouse of evidence, documents, royal inventories, conservation reports, texts that he brings to the study of major masters, but also, as this volume of essay attests, to lesser known and often surprising aspects of the Hispanic artistic world that all of us who are present here today, and many who are not, joyfully inhabit. Jordana will now introduce our first speaker, Professor Edward Sullivan, who is also Jonathan's first doctoral candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts.
Thank you so much, Rob. As Rob mentioned, our next panelist is Edward Sullivan, who is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor of History of Art, as well as the Deputy Director of the Institute of Fine Arts. Edward, I'm going to pass you the microphone, as they say.
Thank you. I'm truly thrilled to be here, of course. How could I not be? I have known Jonathan most of my life, and he was my teacher, my mentor, my friend, my colleague, or is my friend, my colleague, my teacher, mentor, because I'm still learning, as Goya says in that 1826 beautiful drawing of an old man walking down a road with two sticks. Aún aprendo. One is still learning, and I'm still learning from Jonathan, and Jonathan is still learning from Spanish art. So I want to congratulate him, of course, above all, for this wonderful achievement. And also, as today on Rob, the book is wonderful. The book is a beautiful object. And as Estrella very succinctly put it, it was, I think, for Francisco Chaparro, Jonathan's last student, who did a brilliant dissertation, which I had the privilege of reading on his committee about Goya, must have been a huge challenge to translate. So I really want to give my heartfelt congratulations to all. I uncharacteristically am going to read what I wrote because I want to be very concise, and we have so many other interesting people to listen to. So I did want to begin by saying that I find this book that reveals many facets of Jonathan Brown's scholarly history, some of those unknown to people who are not intimately familiar with the breadth of his trajectory, or even to those who know his work very well. There's so many interstices of the history of Spanish art that he interrogates, to use two I words, in this book, that it's really fascinating, even for those of us who have read virtually everything he's written. I have chosen, and it was not an easy choice, two essays that attest to what I would say are characteristics of Brown's research that I find to be especially revelatory and indicative of a restless intellectual personality and a tireless champion for contextualization of art in all of its many facets, from social history, collecting and exhibition history, to boldness in reconfiguring the received knowledge of a given artist or their work. Finally, both of these essays serve as testimonies, as do all of the essays in this book for that matter, to the exquisite nature of Jonathan's mastery of the art of ekphrasis, that is to say, the description and deeply evocative suggestion of both the physical and the emotional properties of a work of art. The two essays in question are numbers 13 and 14 in the book. Let me just share my screen because I have some images. There we are. And they are two essays, one about Murillo's erotic subject matter and the second on Ribera's prints and drawings. I will briefly comment on them in reverse order. So here we have the first image. In late January of 1973, just before Jonathan Brown accepted his post as the director of the Institute of Fine Arts, he began teaching a spring term seminar there on the works of Ribera, Giuseppe de Ribera, with emphasis on his prints and drawings. I knew little about that subject, but enough to realize after several weeks into the course that what Brown was doing was both transgressive and revolutionary. I recall those reactions in reading, after many years, this essay, which originally formed the core of his catalog text for the fall 1973 exhibition that he curated at the Art Museum in Princeton, called specifically Ribera's Prints and Drawings. Now, transgressive might sound like a hyperbolic word to describe what Jonathan Brown was doing, but in the context of the 1970s, still a time when regard for Spanish painting itself was less than fully developed, and I should say less than fully respected, Spanish painters' reputations as principally a la prima artists, that is, those who would create their compositions without the benefit of preliminary drawings, was often the reigning cliche, or rather fallacy. In other words, it was widely believed that Spanish artists were deficient in the area of the graphic arts. A few figures among Spanish scholars, including Felix Bosch in the 1920s and Diego Angulo in the 1960s, had published works in Spanish drawings, but texts that integrated both drawings and prints in an analytical sense in languages other than Spanish were practically non-existent. Later, Angulo would publish his 4-volume corpus of Spanish drawings. Gridley McKim Smith, the American art historian, would do a pioneering but little remembered 1974 exhibition on Spanish drawings of the Baroque in North American collections at the Art Museum at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. And ultimately, Mark MacDonald, today curator at the Met and curator specifically of the current Goya's Graphic Imagination show, would publish his monumental book on prints and drawings of Spain, Renaissance to Goya in 2012. These publications and many more were in many ways inspired by Brown's ruminations and intense studies of drawings of Ribera, Murillo, and many others from the late 1960s onward. Without his audacious accounting of Spanish graphic arts, this area of Hispanic studies would be infinitely more impoverished. Drawings such as this, The Man Tied to a Tree, remind us of Ribera's penchant for scenes of blood and torture, as they might have been described by a 19th century English critic who would have cited, as many did, the artist as a prime representative of the so-called innate cruelty of the Spanish character, that being a sort of a trope in British assessment of Ribera in the 19th century. And indeed, here we observe a man, not only the man tied to a tree, but another man crouching at the base of the tree, seemingly sharpening a knife with which to flay the hapless individual. We are also reminded, of course, of contemporaneous scenes of physical trauma, such as those by the French artist Jacques Callot, contemporary of Ribera, more or less. And of course, we are shown the way to those future images of chaos and torment of warfare, so graphically depicted by Francisco de Goya, which I think is present here too. Ribera's graphic art had wide international reach and was in broadly ranging art historical conversations throughout Europe. Brown eloquently comments in his Ribera essay on both the lyricism and the enigma of such an etching as the 1621 poet in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, an image which, in my mind, fully captures the essence of artistic contemplation. This Dantesque figure, possibly identified by the laurel on his head, is accorded a moment of utter silence and inwardly directed thought. Brown further points out in his essay on Ribera that artist's fascination with physiognomy, and in the study of ears, similar to the study of eyes that Brown publishes in this new translation, his interest in the particularity and at times the deformations of the bodily components of human beings is there. Prints such as these may also have served as instructional images for apprentices, just learning how to cope with the singularities of the body as seen in art, posits Jonathan Brown. Finally, I'm fascinated by the probably serendipitous premonitory relationship between this print by Ribera of ears and eyes, and the 1812 drawing by Goya of 20 hand gestures that constitute sign language, a form of communication that Goya himself, having gone deaf many years earlier, would have employed. This print is illustrated, by the way, in the catalog for the current spectacular Metropolitan Museum exhibition. Murillo was another artist whose critical fortunes were dramatically enhanced within the Anglo-American world of scholarship and public appreciation by Jonathan Brown's work. His essay, published in this new volume, on the erotic elements in some key examples of the civilian master's genre pictures, is an additional instance of what I have described a moment ago as transgressive in nature. This text presents us with a completely convincing picture of taste in Spain, and especially in Andalusia, for scenes of erotic encounters that we usually associate with Northern European genre art of the early modern period. Citing the presence of groups of Dutch merchant collectors in Seville, as well as the enthusiasm in Spain for the art of the so-called bamboccianti, in other words, Dutch artists working in the wide circle of Caravaggio in Italy, and whose paintings had reached Spain through trade and private collections of, for example, the Spanish viceroys in Naples, Brown convincingly argues that this famous picture in the National Gallery, Washington, speaks eloquently of the front and center nature of images of prostitution and sexual solicitation in art. Here, both the smile on the woman leaning on the windowsill, in a work which could easily be described simply as a genre scene, a pretty scene of women at a window in Seville, but he shows us the way into another pathway of discussion of this. We see that the smile on the face of the woman leaning on the windowsill and the position of the veil covering the mouth of the upright figure would be clear signals to a contemporary audience of the allure of the many sex workers routinely depicted by Murillo and his Spanish contemporaries. The most compelling and seemingly enigmatic of such pictures had recently been rediscovered when Brown originally wrote his essay. It had been for many years in a private collection and was at sometimes described as lost. This image of two women and two boys now at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, is perfectly decoded and elegantly described with Freudian-derived elusive language by Brown in his text. The scene constitutes a conversazione erotica, plus what would be called today child pornography. This painting, as assessed by Brown, presents the reader with an unexpected and indeed compelling dimension to a field, Spanish Baroque art, which has been more often associated with ascending virgins and swooning martyrs than with nitty-gritty of the life on the streets. Again, we see a scholar who has breached the traditional walls of pedestrian mid-20th century practices in Spanish art history to establish a new vocabulary and a radical way of considering an old master, in this case Murillo, who had for much too long been associated with sanctimonious sweetness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edward. I'd like to invite our next panelist, Reva Wolf, who is professor of art history at SUNY New Paltz, to join us. Thank you, Reva.
Thank you, Jordana, and thank you all of you for being here today. It's really a great honor to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to jump now right to my PowerPoint, so bear with me. Here we are. Okay, so the scholarship brought together in No Solo Velázquez is as skillful in examining the history of Spanish art as it is at covering the work of individual artists or at exploring Spain's relations with the outside world. It is this last subject, Spain and the world, that I would like to focus on today. It is a subject that runs through many of the essays in No Solo Velázquez. I will highlight 4, which the editors of the book aptly clustered together in the section entitled Cultures and Contexts. Jonathan Brown's interest in intercultural relations, as he himself states in the book's prologue, reflects his own experience as a young scholar in Spanish art in the 1960s, when he felt compelled to introduce to an American audience knowledge of a history then rarely studied outside Spain, due to the closing off of the country during the long-standing dictatorship of Franco. His studies of Spain within the context of the larger world of art making, art collecting, and the problems of early modern Europe's power struggles are expansive in terms of the subjects covered, revealing a vast body of knowledge just as varied as the approaches taken. In my overview of these publications, I will emphasize the main approach of each of the 4 essays listed here. Spain in the Age of Exploration focuses on taste within Spain at a concentrated historical moment. The Root of the Austrias foregrounds historiography, shifts in our perceptions, and along with them in the choices of terms we use. Artistic Relations between Spain and Great Britain explores direct interactions between specific players on the artistic and political stages. Images of the Favorite is a comparative study of how power is represented. Spain in the Age of Exploration presents art in the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella as characterized by a distinctive heterogeneity, evident in Isabella's artistic proclivities in particular, with a range of influences from both without and within Spain being absorbed by artists working in the last decades of the 15th century. Fernando Gallego, for example, was inspired by Flemish artists Queen Isabella admired, such as van der Weyden, adding his own touches, including a concentration on Mary's expression of grief. Pedro de Berruguete, considered the first artist to incorporate Italian Renaissance elements, such as individualizing features, combined these with a Flemish portrait-like realism, and here an ornamental background absorbed in part from the Islamic presence in Spain. Brown lucidly shows how this heterogeneity typified not only painting, but also sculpture and architecture. Observing that several architects working in Spain had come from Northern Europe, bringing the Northern late Gothic manner to Spain with them. Simón de Colonia, whose father was from Germany, designed a stunning chapel in the Burgos Cathedral in this mode. Juan, thought to be from Brittany, fused this style with the patterning and tile work drawn from Islamic architecture, especially in the interior, of a well-known palace in Guadalajara. Jonathan Brown's teaching covered this material. Like his writings, it was not only Velázquez, not even only the 17th century. A course he offered on 16th century art in fall 1979 featured Guaz's work and much more. Thankfully, the quality of study photos has greatly improved since then. And he prepared for his students a dense 6-page bibliography of relevant publications. In retrospect, I can see how his teaching was preparing the way for his later scholarship. The Root of the Austrias moves us deep into the 16th century and to artistic exchanges involving Antwerp, Seville, and Mexico. Brown notes how Flemish prints by the 3 Wierix brothers, here I show 2 examples by Hieronymus, circulated, and paintings too, both finding their way to Spanish America, where they were often used as springboards to create new compositions that suited the local clientele. Excuse me. In this study, Brown foregrounds the limitations of our vocabulary for understanding art, noting that art history has long been configured in terms of national schools in ways that have nothing to do with the realities of artistic exchange. He also finds lacking terms such as colonial, center and periphery, and hybrid, each in its own way implying something less than or unequal. He suggests that instead, in studying Spanish American art, it might be more useful to see it in terms of the circulation of ideas and practices. And in a way, each of the 4 studies I am discussing takes this approach. Artistic relations between Spain and Great Britain reports on intertwined events regarding the movements of people and pictures between the two countries during roughly the first half of the 17th century. Brown builds up the suspense to develop a series of riveting stories, such as of how Titian's portrait of Charles V of Spain with a dog was given by a later Spanish king, Philip IV, to Prince Charles of England when he traveled to Madrid with the Duke of Buckingham in 1623. 2 years later, the prince rose to become King Charles I and, to fast forward, was beheaded in 1649, followed by the sale of his vast art collection, the so-called sale of the century. And for the purposes of paying off his considerable debts, as a result of this sale, Titian's portrait ended up returning to Spain, where it still resides today. After this same sale, Raphael's Holy Family was snagged in a competitive transaction. The French ambassador was looking to acquire it, and also sent to Spain, where, according to a record of the time, it was held in the highest esteem, including by Velázquez, with the king considering it the pearl of his collection. The Duke of Buckingham enters the picture again in imagery of the favorite in England, France, and Spain. Now in a comparative analysis of how three ministers used art to promote their formidable, if often tenuous, positions of power. The Duke of Buckingham at the service of Charles I of England, the Count Duke of Olivares under Philip IV of Spain, and the Cardinal Richelieu working for Louis XIII of France. Thinking of these events of our own time, it is hard not to associate Jonathan Brown's study of 17th century visual strategies for conveying power with the circulation of imagery for similar ends today. Although Brown himself did not make this kind of association in any direct way, I think he opened the door to the possibility. Brown's study of the favorites was published in 1999, the same year Kehinde Wiley received his undergraduate degree and headed off to Yale University, where he completed his MFA in 2001. Wiley seems to fuse the equestrian image of Olivares with the type of gold brocade background seen in the portrait of Richelieu to make a stunning and complex commentary on power, race, history, and representation. When several years later, Wiley had the opportunity to depict a government leader, he carefully considered the kind of president, a man of the people, that the sitter hoped to convey. Replacing the horse with a chair and the lavish gold patterned background with a lush wall of green and flowers. But let's return to the 17th century, when the king's favorite, as Jonathan Brown has so vividly shown, routinely used art to directly or symbolically trample a steady stream of enemies. On our left, the Duke of Buckingham appears in the guise of Mercury, leading the liberal arts to King Charles I, who plays the role of Apollo, while Queen Henrietta Maria sits by his side as Diana. On our right, Olivares, in a tapestry within the picture, is positioned behind King Philip IV in a commemoration of a victory over the Dutch in Brazil. Each of these complex compositions shows the favorite firmly in power, but as Brown emphasizes, with the underlying, or we could say underfoot, message that it could evaporate at any moment and must be continually guarded. In the foreground of Apollo and Diana, a personification of envy is being chased away with the aid of a lit torch and trumpet music. And in the picture within the picture, in the recapture of the Bay of All Saints, Philip IV steps on a personification of heresy, while Olivares walks over discord, who, Brown observes, is a particularly vicious enemy of favorites. During the same period, the 1620s and 1630s, France was also in full combat mode. And pictures also were used to represent the victorious favorite and the repressed enemy. Brown notes that Cardinal Richelieu developed a more ample and varied repertoire of images for the purpose, including an extensive use of prints, thereby allowing for a wider circulation. In this example, with its clever use of allegory, Richelieu tends his garden, as it were, carefully guarding the French fleur-de-lis, having seen to it that the eagle, representing Austria, and the lion, symbolizing Spain, are chained and under France's domination. The lengthy inscription at the bottom of this print reinforces the message provided by the imagery. The opening line, "Can one praise this excellent minister enough?" was borrowed by Jonathan Brown for the title of his essay. He notes that it might be understood to have a double meaning, referring to both the greatness of the favorite and also the need for that greatness to constantly be protected and asserted. In my adaptation of these words, no double meaning is possible. Its significance will be clear to anyone who reads the essays in No Solo Velázquez, which constitute but a fraction of Jonathan Brown's brilliant scholarly output. This excellent professor cannot be praised enough, period. His work is outstanding. Thank you, Jonathan, for your remarkable contributions to our understanding of art history and going along with them, for being such a wonderful teacher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reva. I'm going to invite our next panelist, Miguel Falomir, who is the director of the Prado Museum in Madrid. And for those of us who have been watching the film El Cuadro, in which Jonathan features so prominently, we know that the Prado must be one of Jonathan's most favorite places. And so I expect that he has spent hours and hours speaking with Miguel about the works of the collection. So welcome, Miguel. I'm going to pass you the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordana. Thank you, Estrella and Bob, for inviting me to participate in this extremely well-deserved homage to Jonathan Brown. Although we are celebrating the publication of a book entitled Not Only Velázquez, no solo Velázquez, I have chosen to focus paradoxically on the essays dedicated to Velázquez and to a building to which the artist dedicated many efforts, the Buen Retiro Palace. I do this because for me it is difficult, I would say almost impossible, to think about Jonathan Brown without associating him with the civilian painter and this palace in Madrid. Jonathan Brown has devoted many publications to both, besides the one in this volume. In fact, on the table from which I speak to you lies his monograph on Velázquez and the book that he dedicated together with his friend John Elliot to the Buen Retiro Palace. I have also chosen to speak about these essays for personal reasons. The impact that Jonathan's work on the Spanish Golden Age in general, and Velázquez and the Spanish court in particular, have had on my own training as an art historian. I'm not going to talk about the vital and intellectual circumstances in which Brown began to develop his research in these fields, because he has done so himself in the book In the Shadow of Velázquez, Reflections of a Veteran Hispanist, based on the lectures he gave at the Prado Museum in 2012. But I will add something that I consider important. Jonathan succeeded José López Rey as the Spanish art specialist at the Institute of Fine Arts. And it has always seemed to me that this replacement was not only generational between one person and another several years younger, but also intellectual. Despite the fact that both devoted their greatest efforts to Velázquez, what a different way of approaching to the painter. And yet López Rey's work was probably necessary for what Brown would have to do. I don't think it is by chance that Brown defended his dissertation, which years later was converted into the book Images and Ideas in 17th Century Spanish Painting, in 1964, a year after López Rey published his catalogue raisonné on Velázquez. Although a catalogue raisonné is always a work in progress, and Brown himself has meditated on it several times, it is true that López Rey's was a milestone in the establishment of Velázquez's corpus, and it continues to be the last published despite the almost 60 years that have passed since its publication. Once Velázquez's production was fixed, it was possible to go beyond strictly philological questions. In his aforementioned book, In the Shadow of Velázquez, Brown points out regarding the art historian Diego Angulo, absolute dominator of the discipline in Franco's Spain, that, and I quote, he separated art from culture, end quote. At the end of the 1960s, two art historians there to overcome this distance, Julián Gallego and Jonathan Brown. The first with the book Visión and Símbolos de la Pintura Española del Siglo de Oro. The second with the aforementioned Images and Ideas. Both titles are tremendously revealing. On the one hand, they point out a clear positioning and distancing with respect to the philological studies prevailing until then, and the need to inscribe art in a broader cultural context. Each of them included particular words in their titles that must have raised eyebrows among their readers. Even then, the prevailing vision of Spanish painting was that of its attachment to the naturalistic creed, realism as the quintessence of Spanish art, and Velázquez as its champion. And I'll share with you an anecdote. In my childhood encyclopedia from the late 1960s, Velázquez appeared in an illustration holding a photo camera. So to speak of symbols in the case of Gallego and ideas as Brown did was probably nothing short of heretical. Regarding Brown's ideas, they clash with the marked anti-intellectualism that was wanted for Spanish art. Spanish art was an art without ideas, or at least any idea that was not religious in nature. And not even a building as complex as El Escorial escaped this. El Escorial, Ortega y Gasset had stated, represents, and I quote, our lack of ideas, but at the same time, the exuberance of our impetus, end quote. And artistic ideas were discussed in academies. The art academies of the Golden Age were already addressed in Images and Ideas, and they are also present in the volume with an essay that was originally intended for a book dedicated to the artistic academies in modern Europe. I am particularly interested in this aspect, since one of Brown's main efforts has been to place Spanish art in its European context, something that at the time could seem strange in a country that had chosen Spain is different as its slogan for tourist attraction. And I will come back to this in a minute. I would dare to affirm that the history of taste of the early modern period was a topic that entered Spain to a large extent with Professor Brown and his studies on the courts of Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV. And this volume includes two essays specifically dedicated to these questions. In them, the focus of attention shifts from the artist to the patron, in this case, the Spanish monarchs, which allow for a richer and more ambitious reflection of the artistic production carried out then in the Spanish court. This eagerness to place the work of art in its social and cultural context, but also in its spatial and architectural one, culminated in the book co-written with John Eliot, A Palace for a King, the Buen Retiro and the Court of Philip IV. And it is precisely with Eliot that Brown signs the essay included in this volume on the Marquis of the Castel Rodrigo and his purchases of landscapes paintings for the Buen Retiro. Eliot and Brown's relationship with the Buen Retiro Palace is not limited to research and publications. 20 years ago, they initiated the claim that the remaining building that had once been part of the former palace should be given to the Prado Museum in order to be able to recreate its most emblematic space, the Hall of Realms, with the paintings of Velázquez, Zurbarán, Carducho, Pereda, and others that originally hung on its walls and now belong to the museum. There is a Spanish saying that goes, things in the palace go slowly, las cosas de palacio van despacio, but at the end of last year, with the approval of the new general budget, the government finally released funds to carry out the restoration of the former palace, following a very inspiring project by Norman Foster and Carlos Rubio. If the deadlines are met, Eliot and Brown's dream will come true in 2026. I conclude. I have lived abroad long enough to know the disdain that Spain deserves in the cultural field, and not only in the Anglo-Saxon world. Indeed, in his book, In the Shadow of Velázquez, Jonathan recalled the words of Kenneth Clark justifying the exclusion of Spain from his civilization project. What Brown didn't mention is that Clark's words invariably bring to mind the question, and I quote, what has Spain done for Europe? That Masson de Morvilliers included in the article dedicated to Spain in the Encyclopédie 2 centuries ago. One of Jonathan Brown's most titanic efforts has been to show that the Spanish court was not only not artistically peripheral in the 16th and 17th century Europe, but it was its true center, and that Philip IV not only far outstripped Charles I of England and Louis XIV of France as collector, but was their true model, as Philip II had previously been for Emperor Rudolph II. I met Jonathan in New York in 1994 when he was giving his Mellon lectures at the National Gallery of Art, which would be published shortly after under the title Kings and Connoisseurs Collecting Art in 17th Century Europe, an ambitious and innovative approach to the collecting activity of several European monarchs. This desire to combat Spanish exceptionality and reposition its court in the European context would have a new chapter in the exhibition that he co-curated with John Eliot in 2002 at the Prado Museum, The Sale of the Century, Artistic Relations between Spain and Great Britain, 1604-1655. His contribution to the catalogue is the essay Reva mentioned before, Artistic Relations between Spain and Great Britain, included in the volume we present. Velázquez, Philip IV, and the Buen Retiro are recurring people and places in Brown's studies. And that's why I have focused on them. There is another place that also appears quite often, both in Brown's writings and in my intervention today, the Prado Museum. He constantly alludes to it in the Shadow of Velázquez, and I allow myself to conclude by recommending its reading in order to know better, and in his own words, the author of the volume that has gathered us today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Our last panelist, who I'd like to introduce, is Francisco Chaparro, who was Jonathan's last PhD student. He holds that honor and is an art historian based in Madrid, and has contributed to the catalog for the exhibition, which just opened at the Met, Goya's Graphic Imagination. Francisco, if I can ask, I'm not sure if you can turn a light on your face or reposition. Perfect, just so we can see you a little bit better before you begin.
Is it better?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, if you come a little bit closer to the monitor, we might be able to see you better.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jordana, for the invitation, and thank you to Jonathan Brown and so many distinguished guests and friends. And my experience as a translator and co-editor of this volume is very personal, as I think it is for all of you. And it really goes back to nearly 10 years ago, and around 2012 and 2013, coinciding with my first year at the PhD program at the Institute, I began working as a teaching assistant in some of the courses that were taught by Jonathan Brown. So in the years that followed, he would teach a variety of seminars on subjects ranging from El Greco to New Spanish painting, collecting in America, the golden age of Spanish painting, and of course, Velázquez. So in preparation for those courses, I had to gather all the reading materials for the students, including obviously many essays and book chapters authored by Jonathan Brown himself in different moments of his career. So that experience provided me indirectly with a panoramic view of many decades of work, and I was able to see the many subjects he had addressed throughout his career. So to my surprise, even though he was by far one of the most well-known art historians in Spain, even beyond well-known beyond specialized circles, some of these texts were not available in Spanish. Others were simply very exceptionally rare. I remember a book published by the government of Oregon on the occasion of the 1992 International Exposition in Seville, and Jonathan Brown contributed with a chapter on 18th century Spanish painting, which was a relatively unusual topic for him. Or for that matter, the articles on the artistic academies in Spain, the Miguel Falomir just mentioned, or his article on Caravaggio and the Spanish donor that are part of these volume published by KJCC. So, and on top of that, one of his most recent publications, or at the time I start working with him, the catalog of Goya's last works, was not available in Spanish as the exhibition did not travel. And I was particularly sorry that the text was not available in Spanish, and I had missed his seminar on Goya at the Institute by just one semester. So at the moment, I realized that it would be great to have a collection of essays in Spanish with so many of the essays he had written over the years on issues not directly related to Velázquez. Also, for me, it was very interesting the brief surveys on the history of Spanish art that are contained in this volume and span from the late Gothic period to the 20th century. It was a pretty nice surprise to read Jonathan Brown commenting on Miro and Picasso and their place in the Spanish tradition. So in any case, I can say that my duties as a doctoral fellow and last of Professor Brown's students granted me the chance to deepen into Jonathan Brown's output in a unique way. So obviously, when I was invited to participate in this project by Estrella, Raul, and Rob, it looked like a nice culmination to a personal journey that had been initiated a few years before as a doctoral student. And moreover, and importantly, as part of the same experience, while I was working as a TA, I witnessed firsthand how graduate students responded to these articles and essays. Many of them were interested mainly in contemporary or non-Western subjects, and in most cases were not familiar to Spanish art history at all. So my close contact with them reaffirmed to me that Jonathan Brown's work retained a great pedagogical interest for new generations of readers and prospective art historians. For instance, as Dr. Sullivan mentioned before, his 1982 essay on reverse drawing on print remains a wonderful introduction to the graphic technique of the artist that was as insightful for students in the 1980s when it was released as it is today, or it was 10 years ago. So in a way, I agree that one of the most interesting facts about this book is not being merely a collection of essays, but they together make up a sort of intellectual biography of Jonathan Brown, because they reflect Jonathan Brown's activity at the Institute at NYU over the years, and also the evolution of his scholarly interests. And to a good extent, the evolution of Spanish art history in the US. As Miguel Falomir mentioned, Brown was José López Reve's replacement at the Institute, who in turn had joined Walter S. Cook, a medievalist who was the founder director of the Institute. And it's interesting how the interest in the 1920s and 30s was Spanish medieval art, then it moved to the Old Masters, and finally, in the last 25 years, probably we can say that Spanish viceregal painting emerged as an important field on its own, coinciding with the boom of modern and contemporary Latin American art market, to the point that in some departments in the US, Spanish art is more now seen like an appendix to viceregal painting and not the opposite, as it used to be the case. So in the end, for me, these books becomes extraordinarily useful to understand the impact of his works and of many of Brown's former students, some of whom are here present, in expanding the map of Spanish art history and making of it a more diverse endeavor. So this process of change and transformation, whose high points, I believe, were the Pintura de los Reinos exhibition project 20 years ago, or the publication of Painting in Latin America, co-authored with Luis Elena Alcalá, is represented eloquently in this volume, I think, by the chapter on art in the root of the Spanish Habsburgs. To me, that short essay condenses brilliantly a renewed view of Spanish art as a fragment within a whole fabric of interactions, where cross-cultural perspectives replace a former desire for national identity or cultural integrity in Spanish art history. So the thematic span of this book is in a way very dynamic, as it reflects the expansion of the author's own interests and also the impact Jonathan Brown's output had on the field of Spanish art history. So another important contribution of this book, in my mind, is the opportunity to contextualize his work in a chronological fashion. Each of these chapters can be seen as ramified into a number of dissertations, articles, and books written by many of his students who went on to become very important specialists in their own fields. Just in one specific theme, the history of collecting and patronage, which is illustrated in several chapters in this volume, such as the one dealing with Lerma, Alcalá, and Castel Rodrigo, can be connected chronologically with important dissertations supervised by Brown that related directly or not directly with these issues. And I'm thinking of those dissertations written by Sarah Scrott, Marcus Burke, Alejandra Vergara, or Lisandro O'Neill, to name but a few. So for a scholar who defines himself as a traditional art historian, as Jonathan Brown has done in several occasions, it is remarkable to see how his intellectual interests align with recent trends in Spanish art history in many respects. By traditional art historian, I believe he means a practitioner of a field based on evidence and analysis, as well as one that invites to direct contact with the works. For me, the article in the Met's Portrait of a Man that was reattributed to Velázquez a few years ago was very special, because as a student, I had the extraordinary opportunity to go to the Met and see the painting with him and Michael Gallagher no long after its discovery. And I remember Jonathan Brown explaining to us his famous 10-second rule mentioned in the chapter, right in front of the painting, and highlighting the role of intuition when it comes to art historical informed looking, which he considered to be an art. And I believe that article and the chapter on Goya's made to capture very vividly that unique experience of visiting the Met or the Frick galleries with Jonathan Brown. But importantly, they resonate perfectly with the material turn in academia, that is reconsidering the value of physical expertise, material expertise, and knowledge or connoisseurship, if you want. I think this is seen now not as the opposite to a more theoretically driven art history, but as a way of expanding thought and finding new complex relations, human relations through objects. So in this sense, Jonathan Brown's whole work stands to me as a masterclass in close looking, argumentative reasoning, persuasiveness, and the power of description. And I remember showing him the super high resolution image of Las Meninas at the time it was launched by Google Arts and Culture. And we were in his office, and he was amazed at the opportunity to see the painting in very, very small detail in his computer. I recall briefly the moment he came to visit John Briley while he was restoring the actual painting. So I think this concern for materiality is here to stay. Perhaps it will be articulated in a different way with different tools, but this is one of the aspects that make his work more relevant than ever, and this book more necessary than ever. And as a final point, I would like to stress a fact that I think is surprisingly overlooked very often in relation to our historical writing, but was mentioned by Raoul Lubar, which is style. And Jonathan Brown is a great writer. Translating a book like this is not easy, but it makes you appreciate some nuances and stylistic details and decisions that are otherwise more difficult to perceive. So Spanish art history written in Spanish used to be somewhat obscure and verbose, and at times a little bit opinionated, I'd say. So on top of that, the issues of attribution and restorations became occasionally very controversial, as we know. In the 90s and later, it was not uncommon for topics like these to be the subject of heated discussions on TV or the pages of the most popular newspapers or even documentaries. So for these reasons, to me, his writing style and his elegance is as much a stylistic issue as an ethical standpoint that derives from a deep concern for intellectual honesty and argumentative clarity. And I think that this fact is evident in each of these essays, and is actually a fundamental trait of his whole intellectual personality. To me, as an editor, as a translator, as a student, but also as a reader, this book stands above all as an antidote against dogmatism and dullness, which I think are the greatest enemies of our history. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisco. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists, Rob, Estrella, Edward, Reva, Miguel, and Francisco, for illuminating the very different aspects that are in No Solo Velázquez. I also think that their comments highlight for us the role of generosity and readership and mentorship and kind of rigor over time that Jonathan really models for us in this collection of essays. And I also think one of the things that Francisco pointed out, which is so instructive, is that we need not be a specialist of Golden Age Spanish painting to appreciate Jonathan's scholarship. And I think that is, one of the really wonderful lessons that we get from bringing together a scholar's writing over the arc of their career, is the kind of lessons that we might bring back to our own practice as scholars, as writers, as teachers, as students, as mentors. So once again, I know that we've had over 200 people watching and joining us. So from our own screens, I would like to offer a virtual round of applause to all of our panelists, and the greatest round of applause to Jonathan for the gift that he has given us in working so hard with Estrella and Rob and Francisco to bring this book out in Spanish, and really looking forward to seeing in the years to come the waves of influence that the book will extend over future scholars. I want to also, while we're here, extend another thank you and appreciation to Raul Garcia Bravo of Cátedra Madrid, and also remind everyone that through Wednesday at noon, we can still watch Andrés Sanz's 2019 film El Cuadro, in which we get to hear Jonathan so vividly explained the different aspects of the painting, along with so many of his colleagues in and out of the museum. To remind everyone that should you want to listen again to this presentation, in a little while, it will be available on the IFA website and the KJCC website. And with that, I'd like to just again, thank you all for joining us. Thank Jonathan for the gift of this book, Estrella and Rob and Francisco for putting it together, and all of our panelists for spending the afternoon with us, sharing their thoughts about the different essays in the book. Thank you all very much.